Welcome, everyone, and happy Friday. Thank you for attending our Tax Matters Q&A. My name is Nicole Wesley, and I work at TheDream.Us as the Senior Program Manager of Career Supports. I'm excited to have with us our guest speaker today, Professor Francine Lipman. She works at UNLV, University of Nevada, Las Vegas, Boyd School of Law, where she is a professor of tax law. She has expertise in tax law and taxation of business entities and has worked closely with undocumented populations and assisting them with tax matters, including how do I get an ITIN, how do I get an EIN, and small business taxation. So with that said, thank you, Professor Lipman, for joining us today. I don't know if there's anything I've missed in terms of if you want to share a little bit more about your background and expertise.
No, so thank you very much for that introduction. And it's really been fun and inspiring and motivating to be part of the TheDream.Us. And working with students. As a law professor, I get to work with students, but I don't get to work with undergrads. I have taught undergrads at a different point in my life, and I have to say, after spending a couple decades teaching law students, undergrads have a lot more energy and a vision and excitement about the future. Because, and I will tell you this, the future is yours. And so take that ball and run with it. I work with tax, in addition to being a lawyer, I'm also a CPA. And I mentioned that just because, well, first of all, it's still tax season, and a lot of my CPA friends are kind of chasing to the finish because the last deadline for filing your 2021 tax return is actually Monday. So that's October 17th. You can actually extend your 2021 tax return for 6 months from April 15th until October 15th. But because October 15th falls on a Saturday, that's extended to Monday. So I say that just because tax matters, and taxation is really intimidating for a lot of people. And unfortunately, as many of you understand, it's really intimidating for immigrants where English is a second language, or they just are not used to the federal income tax system. And in fact, it's so interesting because if you think about it, Nicole, we're born, if you're born in the US, you're kind of surrounded by tax issues from day one. So you don't think about, it's kind of natural to think about taxes. But if you're new to this country, it's a completely different environment to have to navigate, as well as so many other issues. But what's so important, especially for immigrants, and I would say particularly for unauthorized immigrants, you really need to make sure you're compliant. And the reason I say that is because any path to naturalization, to legalization is going to require, as a condition precedent, that you're fully in compliance with the federal income tax system. And we've seen that again and again. So hopefully, fingers crossed, toes crossed, eyes crossed, we will see immigration reform. But if it does, you want to be ready with all your ducks in a row. And more importantly, if you're working, if you're engaged, if you're a student, there are tax benefits out there. And if you don't reap the benefits, there is a statute of limitations. And so you want to always be timely. The early bird catches the worm. And so we don't want you to miss out on any of these benefits. unfortunately, it's complicated. And so you've got to network with groups like TheDream.Us and other networks that will help you and support you as you become more and more engaged with our government agencies and just interacting as a American resident.
Yes, I agree that networking to better understand the tax world and networking in general is very important. So thank you, Professor Lipman, for that introduction. And I think let's first kick it off with, if you want to, first of all, thank you, scholars, for joining us as well. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat if you would like. Feel free to also put a question in the chat. You can also private message me a question and I will ask that on your behalf. And I'll give you all some time to do that and think of questions if you have any, but I will kick it off with the first question. And that would be, Professor Lipman, if you could inform us of what is an ITIN and how can an ITIN be helpful for undocumented immigrants outside of generating income?
So in order to file a tax return, and this is federal or state, I know that all of you are from across the country. And so most states of the United States have a state income tax. And so in order to file a tax return, you need some sort of taxpayer identification number. US citizens, whether you're born in this country, whether you're a dreamer who are not citizens, but who have been given certain accommodations, or if you are a naturalized citizen, we get a Social Security number. If you are unauthorized, you do not qualify for a Social Security number. But if you have a tax obligation, the federal government wants you to be compliant. So there's this other number that's a taxpayer identification number. It's an ITIN, and that's an acronym that stands for Individual Taxpayer Identification Number, right? ITIN. And so that is the number that unauthorized immigrants need and use to be tax compliant. You have to apply for it. So what's interesting is that US citizens, I had to actually apply for my Social Security number when I was 12 or 13. But now newborns, I mean, they almost put it on your head. They almost, as soon as you're born, the hospital takes care, combined with parents, takes care of filing for it, and newborns get it quite quickly. But unfortunately, unauthorized immigrants have to navigate a pretty complicated system. And you have to have a tax obligation. So that means there has to be an affirmative reason for you needing to file a tax return. So if you work, if you have a W-2, that's the form you get for when you're an employee. At the end of the year, you get a W-2. If you're an independent contractor and you get a 1099, you have to file a tax return. So the way you get the ITIN, it's kind of curious because you prepare the tax return, which requires a number. You don't have that number yet. So you file that tax return, not electronically, but remember paper? Yeah, you print it out and you have to mail it, US Postal Service, together with your ITIN application. That in and of itself would be hard, but it gets worse because you have to prove to the federal government you exist. Well, how the heck do you do that? The way you do that is by sending in, if you can believe this, your passport. Yes, you have to send it in, and the application is a paper application too. It's, very old school here. So you send in your passport, yes, mailing your passport to the Internal Revenue Service to prove you exist, to prove you're foreign born with this W-7, which is the ITIN application, and then also with your tax return. You mail all that in to a special IRS office that happens to be in Austin, Texas, and then you wait and you wait and you wait because they're very backed up for them to process it. And eventually they will mail you a letter that has your ITIN number on it. This is frustrating because it requires a lot of intervention. The good news is there are special certified individuals like myself who are something called certified acceptance agents. And what we're trained to do is look at your original documents. And by the way, it doesn't just have to be a passport, but the passport's the easiest document if you can get that. There are other documents which I'm happy to share with you if you don't have a passport. But the nice thing about the passport is, you may or may not know, is it has a picture of you so somebody can identify you. It also has your name, where you were born, and those sort of details. But someone like myself, who's a certified acceptance agent, we can look at the passport, look at you, look at other documentation, and authenticate that document so you don't have to mail that in. So if you're going to apply for an ITIN, I would encourage you to try to work with a CAA, Certified Acceptance Agent, so you don't have to mail in your passport. Reason I say that is I really don't want anyone to be without their passport, because it makes you feel vulnerable. As a US citizen, I don't like mailing my passport out into the world. And while the IRS tries to return that to you within 60 days, that's a long period of time. And not surprisingly, there have been passports that have been lost in this process. So.
Yeah, thanks, Professor Lipman, for informing us of the surprisingly antiquated paper application to apply for an ITIN number, as well as having to mail in important identification documents like a passport that you mentioned, and I would agree with, to go around mailing in your passport, which we would discourage, looking for a local CAA agent. And I put a link in the chat recently to find a local certified acceptance agent near you. I do see a follow-up question in the chat. How much is the fee to apply for an ITIN?
Great question. And that actually has a great answer. Zero. It's zero to pay the IRS, but you might have to pay somebody to prepare it. And many of these CAAs are accountants who are for-profit businesses, and so you might have to pay them. And so you start layering these things on top, in addition to maybe having to pay someone to prepare your tax return. There are free resources that are available. And I know Nicole's got links to this on the IRS website, honestly, across the country. So you put in your zip code and it'll find hopefully volunteer income tax assistance in your area. But as a backup, it's if you can't find anyone and you can find someone that you pay, that might be better than not doing it. But the short answer to your question is the Internal Revenue Service does not charge you anything. There's no application fee. There might be a professional fee to process it.
Thank you for that information, Professor Lipman. Did you say roughly, I know the fees can vary if you go through a professional like a CAA to assist with preparing those documents. Oh, and it looks like Gabby put that in the chat. But do you know what the fee could vary? Is it between $100 to $500?
So that's about right. It's so hard to say because unfortunately, and I've seen this and I want you to be aware of it, there is price gouging. And unfortunately, immigrants are more subject to price gouging. So just be cautious. The nice news is that these links have names, and quite often in larger cities, there's a number of them. I know in Las Vegas, where I live and work, there are a number of CAAs, and you can start to call them. At one point, kind of pre-pandemic, we were seeing that some of the charges were in the as high as $300. And that's one reason why it really motivated me to do it on a pro bono basis. Pro bono means for free in Latin. And so I do a lot of pro bono work. I wish I could help each and all of you. But speaking of antiquation, you cannot authenticate online. And so I have to do it face to face. So if you happen to be in Las Vegas, send me an email and we could do some face to face.
Good to know. And I know we have some scholars in the Las Vegas area that may reach out to you to take you up on that offer.
Good.
So another question I see through the chat is, how can you apply for an ITIN if you don't work or have never worked? Are there other things that can be filed in the tax return, for example, scholarships?
So that has been a constant problem because for immigrants especially, and frankly, for all kind of young entrepreneurial people, it's like a chicken and the egg. You feel like you need the number in order to be able to start your business or be able to work. The IRS doesn't perceive it that way. So they're really concerned, frankly, because of anti-immigrant animus from Congress, that there's fraud in this area. So they really only want to give it to people who have an obligation. The good news is many of you might already have an ITIN if you were claimed as a dependent on your parents' tax return. So when your parents filed, if they did, they might have applied for an ITIN for you. So you might have gotten it that way. Alternatively, if you are a student, college student, higher education, first 4 years of college, there is a partially refundable tax credit. And even if you don't have any earned income, you can file a tax return to get this credit. And the credit is called the American Opportunity Tax Credit. And despite that interesting name, you do not need a Social Security number to qualify for this credit. If you have an ITIN, you can qualify. So you could file a tax return. You have to have paid tuition and or books for higher education and not have had that fully covered by a scholarship. So if you're not out of pocket net any tuition, and I kind of hope that's the case for some of you, then you can't get this credit, because the credit is to reimburse you for out-of-pocket expenses paid. Most individuals don't get 100% free ride. So even if you paid $100, and many people don't get books reimbursed, you can still apply for this credit, and that can be an ITIN application.
Okay, yeah, that's great to know. I do know our scholars receive a full ride, so their tuition is paid for. But if they are paying out-of-pocket expenses, for example, like you just said, Professor Lipman, books or any associated fees with classes, that can be used to apply to this American Opportunity Tax Credit.
What doesn't apply, a lot of students will ask me this, because what are the other expenses you have to pay for? Of course, housing. It doesn't include housing. And so it's tuition and fees and required books. Well, that's why the federal government wants to make sure when I fill out my book request, I put what's required. And in some cases, more undergrad, there's required equipment. I don't know if you need lab equipment or, a microscope or something, but if that's required equipment, that can be covered as well. So, but it wouldn't be something like a paper or a laptop unless it's required by, and I think at one point, some of the schools were actually requiring laptops to try to get that covered. But I think some of those schools were also providing the laptops to students. But usually most students end up out of pockets for books to some extent.
Okay. A follow-up question to that last question is, if I need to apply to an ITIN and I've never worked before, and can I go to a CAA for them to help me figure out what tax credits I could apply to help apply and get my ITIN number?
So that's a great question. And I guess in a perfect world, and I always dream of the perfect world, what I would suggest you do, start off with trying to find a volunteer income tax assistance program that, they'll provide the tax preparation for free. And if you say you're a higher education student, they'll know what to look at. And usually higher ed students get something called a 1098T, which shows their tuition paid, and it often shows their scholarship. And you should have receipts, maybe credit card receipts or maybe just bank withdrawals to show for or receipts for your book. So you should have that. But if you take that to a VITA site, and hopefully a VITA site in some of the VITA sites have CAAs. Boy, that's a grand slam, because they can do your return for free. The CAA can prepare your W-7, authenticate documents, and get it all ready. Maybe they'll have you mail it in, but that's the easy part. So start off with that. If you can't find that, then I would still go to VITA, have them prepare the return, and then take the paper return. Don't have them electronically file it. Take it with you and then search for CAA. I have had, just to tell you all the options, I have had students, law students, who successfully, had the return prepared and then filled out the W-7 form. And if you Google it, it'll come up. It's actually not that hard to fill out. It's one page. It asks your name, your address, pretty simple questions. Fill that out, and then you send in the original documents. I wouldn't advise that, but I have had students, law students, do that successfully. And so that is an option if you can't find a CAA and you feel like your back's against the wall, you want to do this. And I have some experience in Las Vegas. We do have quite a supportive Mexican embassy, and they provide passports, same-day service for, a fairly reasonable fee. So God forbid your passport should be lost, at least in some places, some cities, you can get a replacement. So that's not perfect, but we've always got to think about backup options.
Thanks for that information. Very, very, very helpful. And thank you for also mentioning the VITA program, which scholars, I advise you to reach out to your college campuses, ask your scholar advisor if they know of a VITA program happening on campus or in your community. You can also ask your business department. I know when I used to work in higher ed, there was many VITA programs on our campuses, and a lot of the business faculty were helping run those. So great.
Lots of accounting students will end up, want to be CPAs. I certainly did that as an undergrad as well. And you're right, they're often on campus. And those on-campus sites are really familiar with the higher education tax credits.
Great to know. So moving on to, we are very active in the chat, so this has been really helpful. The next question is, how long does it take for the application to process?
So another great question. It's somewhat seasonal, right? So tax season, not surprisingly, this office is really busy. And so during what the IRS website says is 6 to 13 weeks, but that really was pre-COVID. So COVID shut down everything, slowed down everything. The IRS ended up with a crazy big backlog. They're working through that fairly well now. But during tax season, they actually say 4 to 6 months. And so it could be significantly longer. In the worst case scenarios, I've seen it take a year. That's why, but they also say they try to get your documents back to you within 60 days. So usually you get your documents returned to you more quickly than the return and the ITIN application being processed. So I have seen it come back as quickly as 6 weeks and taken as long as 4 to 6 months.
Okay. Good information to know, and something we advise our scholars: the earlier you can apply for an ITIN number, the better. I also want to go back quickly to something you mentioned, Professor Lipman, about for some of our scholars, you may already have an ITIN number and not know about it. And Professor Lipman, you mentioned that if their parents claimed them as a dependent on past tax records, they may already have an ITIN number. So can you tell us where scholars, when they go to their parents and ask about this, what tax forms should they look at? Where specifically could they find their ITIN number if they already have one?
So many undergrads, like each and all of you, in order to provide financial information. Many of you, because of your age, because you're full-time students, you can be claimed as a dependent on your parents' tax return. And even, obviously, as soon as you were born, your parents could claim you to the extent they filed federal income taxes. So I work quite a bit with higher ed academics, and I know that unauthorized immigrants have a much more challenging time getting financial aid. But I understand, especially if you're US citizen kids in the family, parents will often, who are unauthorized, file tax return for FAFSA. And I think that's the acronym, isn't it? Financial aid, FSA. So for FAFSA. So, but in any case, hopefully, not only, see, you're the next generation of being advocates. Not only should you file tax returns, but your parents should as well, in order to get refunds, because most individuals who are employees, and when I say employee, I mean that you are paid by the hour, or you are paid weekly, and there's withholding taken out of your paycheck, you are over withheld. So when you file, the IRS, the federal government, not surprisingly, over withholds, so that when you file, you get a refund. That's very intentional, because they want to motivate you to file. And so how can we motivate you? With getting money back. I mean, if everyone had to pay, no one would file, right? And so the structure is to over withhold and file for a refund. So ask your parents if they have filed federal tax returns at any point in time. Then you want to look at those federal income tax returns. So hopefully they have a copy. Working with a lot of generations of unauthorized immigrants, my experience has been that parents and even grandparents, they keep papers. They have a good file system, because they know how critical papers are. And I have seen these files and old pieces of paper really very well organized. So ask your parents for their tax returns. It's going to be a Form 1040, which is the federal income tax annual return. And obviously it's got to be a return after you were born. And take a look at that form. And on the face of the form, on page 1, it'll say dependents, and it should have your name and then a number. And the title to the slot where your number will be, it will say Social Security number. But because you don't qualify for a Social Security number, your ITIN number will be there. By the way, one way to identify an ITIN number, they always start with a 9. So they always start with a 9, and otherwise look like a Social Security number. So it's 3 digits starting with a 9, then there's a dash, 2 numbers, then there's a dash and 4 numbers. So it looks just like a Social Security number, only it starts with a 9. Your parents, to the extent they have ITINs, when they first started issuing ITINs, they actually issued them on a card that kind of looks like the Social Security card, if you've ever seen one. Typically they're paper, they're blue and white. They have your name, Social Security number in the middle, and then on the back, it's got a bunch of just verbiage. but so the ITINs were issued on these cards. But because those were mistaken for social security numbers, the federal government changed it, and now they issue it in a letter. So it's just a letter saying this is your ITIN number.
Very, very informative. Thank you for that. Next question is, can ITIN numbers expire?
So another great question. Social security numbers expire when you expire. And so your social security number is your number until you die. Once you die, your social security number dies with you. ITINs, we thought they were similar to social security numbers so that they would just last forever. The Congress was upset with all the ITINs out there, and there were initially about 30 million ITINs. So in order to, they ramped up the system, made it more challenging to get one, and then they caused all the older ones to expire. So any ITIN that was issued before 2013 has expired. The good news is those could be renewed. And so I've been renewing them left and right. The good news is to renew one, you don't have to file a tax return, but you do have to authenticate yourself. You use that same W-7 form and you just check the renewal box. You have to have your ITIN. So if you renew it, you keep the same number. So it's, you don't get a new number. So you keep the same number, and an ITIN will expire, even a newly issued one, if you do not use it on 3 consecutive returns. So that shouldn't happen unless you leave the country, and then you won't need one, right? So so once you get it, you should use it annually and file your tax returns. But if you miss 1 year because maybe you're not working, maybe you're not going to school, that won't cause it to lapse. It's 3 consecutive years, which is a pretty long time. And then even if it expires, you can renew it after that.
Good to know. In regards to applying for the ITIN, what happens if you take out loans? By chance, is that a reason to qualify for applying for an ITIN?
See, that is an area of frustration, right? Because when you go to a bank, whether you're depositing money or borrowing money, they want some identification from you. Why do they want some identification number from you? To see if you're a good investment, right? They want to check your credit score. And the way we do that in this country is generally through social security numbers. So borrowing money, the bank might want an identification number. The only identification number you can provide to them if you don't have a social or an ITIN might be your passport. So there are numbers on a passport. But borrowing money does not generate income. So you get the cash and you also have the liability. So that's not an accession to wealth. So it is not a qualifying reason to file a tax return. But that often, the bank will ask for a taxpayer identification number. And so that becomes frustrating.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of what you mentioned earlier, chicken
Exactly.
or the egg.
Exactly.
So,
exactly.
the next question I have is, up until what age can you be claimed as a dependent on your parents' taxes?
So another good question, when President Trump came into office, pretty quickly, he and his administration enacted something called the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. And it cut taxes for the wealthy and added some other issues for many of us, including that they eliminated the deduction for dependents. And so presently, that deduction doesn't exist. They expanded other deductions to try to mitigate that harm, and to some extent they did. But beginning in 2026, the Trump administration's Tax Cut and Jobs Act is going to expire. So those dependency deductions will come back in 2026 if Congress doesn't do anything. And by the way, make sure everyone you know does vote, because Congress writes the tax laws, not the IRS. So you have to be engaged with that. And so under the old rules and under the rules that might be resurrected, if you're a full-time student, it was under age 25. So if you're a full-time student, under age 25, otherwise under age 18. So you're dependent if you're basically in high school. So under age 18, or if you're a full-time student up to, but not including age 25. So that's kind of consistent with reality.
Okay. Looking at the chat is still posing a lot of questions, which is great. Next question, can you file at any time, or do you have to file during the tax season?
Good question. So if you are looking for a refund, if you're filing a refund claim, then there is a statute of limitations, and that statute of limitations is 3 years past the due date. So April 15th of 2022 just passed. And if we look back, April 15th for 2022, you were filing your 2021 tax return, right? And so you can file that tax return for 2021 and still get your refund until April 15th, 2025. So the answer is you've got a lot of time. It doesn't have to, if for a refund, got lots of time, actually years. You don't have to file during tax season. Beyond that date, you won't get your money. The refund availability is lapsed. Now, if you owe money, not surprisingly, the federal government, the statute of limitations never lapses, so they can come after you and you can file and pay at any time. Unfortunately, that means penalties and interest. But I think you're thinking that, you know, you might not file by April 15th, but right now you can file for 2020, 2021, and 2019 and get your refund. So.
Okay, yeah, it sounds like that's great that there's a 3-year time frame where you can file. So good to know. Another question, what do you say to students who are completely off the grid or afraid to create a paper trail and risk deportation?
So the federal government has codified into law that your tax information is private. The federal government can't share that even with other agencies unless it is some sort of criminal emergency. So my experience working on the front lines with immigrant groups, including the National Immigration Law Center, MALDIF, Unidas, I can never say that, Unidas, the dream is that we want people to file. And so that information is private. I encourage everyone to write, to include their name and address. Frankly, that information is pretty readily available from other areas. And so I would encourage people to do it. But like anything in life, there are always some risks. I think that in this area, the risks, if you balance them, are well worth taking. I have never seen anyone, the federal government, come after anyone from filing a tax return that wasn't tax fraud or something. I have been an expert witness in cases where state, so this was a case, it's public information, a sheriff in Greeley, Colorado, so it was a state person, tried to take tax returns from a tax preparer who was an immigrant, and she did a lot of tax returns for unauthorized immigrants. She also did translation services. So the sheriff tried to seize those tax returns, start going through them and deporting people. And the good news is the ACLU, which is a legal group that advocates against discrimination, they came in and they got an order to shut that down. We litigated it in Colorado, and not only did the ACLU prevail on behalf of all of these immigrants, but they also were able to get their legal fees reimbursed, and that sheriff obviously didn't get reelected. And, they stopped that at the source. But, you just be cautious and use organizations that you trust, just like with anything else.
I have another question, and I think this comes from a staff member working with some of our scholars at institution. I work with some undocumented students who have violated their visas. Should they be applying for an ITIN? Wouldn't that trip some alarm somewhere?
So many unauthorized immigrants are visa overstayers. And I see that all the time, especially when I'm looking at their documentation, their authentication. That should not trip anything. Again, this same confidentiality rule applies to not providing that information to other agencies. So I have applied for ITINs for visa overstayers. That's a large percentage of unauthorized immigrants are visa overstayers. So I don't think that that is any additional risk as compared to someone who's crossed the border.
Next question. Does financial aid or scholarships affect you, or is it bad if you are in a I-94 adjusting status process?
So that is an immigration question that I am not able to answer. So I'm not an immigration lawyer, so I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, and what I would suggest for those that are interested in knowing the answer to that question is attending our future immigration Q&A with one of our immigration attorneys. So
perfect. Yep. The intersection of tax and immigration overlaps, but we like to keep in our own lanes. And some of the terms that I use are terms for tax, but not the same for immigration law. So it is confusing.
Mhm. Can a person build credits with an ITIN?
Again, good question. So I've heard mixed answers to this. If you ask that, so I do believe that you can. However, some agencies will say that you can't, but I know that when the DREAM Act first came out, dreamers qualify for a social security number, but a lot of the dreamers had ITINs. And so they had developed a credit record with their ITINs. And so we advised them to send a letter to each of the big three credit agencies, asking the credit agency to transfer their credit information from the ITIN to their social security number. You are also supposed to notify the IRS if you get a social security number. Transfer my information from the ITIN to the social security number so that you can have that information. And I think that really is important if we get immigration reform, because quite often you want to demonstrate how long you've been in the United States, and tax returns and tax filings are really great and compelling evidence. And so keeping that continuity of you and your history is important. Unfortunately, many folks have the same name as someone else, so your name isn't necessarily dispositive.
Moving on to the next question, since I know we're running low on time, is it more beneficial for students to file as a dependent through their parents or as an independent? And second question, is there a threshold where you don't have to file?
So, really good questions. Basically, under tax law, you are either, it's a facts and circumstances analysis, and so you are either a dependent or you're not. It's really not an option. So the question is, if you have, if you're living at your parents' house and they're supporting you, then you are dependent. If you are living on your own and they are not supporting you, because you could live outside of the house and your parents could be supporting you, but if you are living on your own and they're not supporting you, then basically you're not a dependent. So it's really a facts and circumstances analysis. And you look at, to the extent who's paying the costs. Now, if you are borrowing money and paying or using scholarships to pay your costs, then you're supporting yourself. During the pandemic, because of economic impact payments and generally speaking, it was better not to be a dependent. However, that doesn't really apply to unauthorized immigrants because, as you know, you had to have a social security number to get the economic impact payments. So when I work with a student, so I have students who are dreamers, they have social security numbers, and perhaps if it's borderline, they're pretty much supporting themselves, but mom may contribute something to their household. During the pandemic, it was very clear it was better not to be a dependent. I hope that helps.
Yes, I think it did. So So you mentioned you've worked with Dreamers in the past, and those with work authorization and have a social security number. So the next question is, I have a student with a social security number for when she was an au pair, but it expired. Should she still be using the social security number on taxes?
So social security numbers never expire, but what does expire potentially is work authorization, right? And so if you get, so for dreamers out there, if the DREAM Act goes away, you still use your social security number, even if it doesn't authorize work. So once you get a social security number under current law, you stick with it. And it supposedly never expires. Again, that's statutory law, so could change, but to date, it's never expired.
Mm-hmm. And I'll also mention for our scholars on the call that currently have DACA, knowing the current state of DACA, if the DACA program ends, do know that, like Professor Lipman mentioned, your social security number will not expire, so you continue using that for tax returns. And you don't need to worry about applying for an ITIN number because you will still have a social security number. So
Exactly. So you keep with that number, and even though it doesn't authorize work anymore, but just to let you know, before the ITIN, everybody got a social security number. And so I work with unauthorized immigrants who are in their 70s who have a social security number. It's theirs. It doesn't authorize work, but it's been theirs since they came to this country. So your parents, maybe your grandparents, have social security numbers. That's what they should file tax returns for. Unfortunately, they can't collect social security benefits or Medicare. This is the hardship, even though many of them have contributed for 30 plus years into the system, paying social security and Medicare taxes. If they apply, they won't get benefits. So there's a lot of mis and disinformation out there. And if you, as an ITIN holder, if you work, you have to pay social security and Medicare, even though you currently don't qualify. It's not fair. But got to use our voices.
yeah, I agree. It's unfortunate and not fair. You are a wealth of information, Professor Lipman. We are running into the end of the hour. Thank you so much for answering all of our questions. Before everyone gets off the call here, I wanted to, I think I shared the right screen. Does everybody see the career development hours?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so just want to put a plug in for other career development related events happening the rest of this semester. Career development hours, we had our first one earlier this week, but we will have our second one on Tuesday, November 8th from 2 to 3 p.m. Pacific time. Same sort of structure. It's going to be an informal Q&A style where you can drop in and ask any questions as it relates to your career development, entrepreneurship, starting a small business, and so forth. Thank you everyone for joining our first Tax Matters Q&A. We will be having a second one the second week in November as well on Thursday, November 10th from 2 to 3 p.m. Pacific time. So hopefully you'll be able to join that second one if you still have questions and are wanting to learn more about your tax related questions. And lastly, I wanted to plug our summer career series that we had this past summer in July, where we had 5 great career related sessions that are recorded for you to view on YouTube. And Professor Lipman actually presented on the ITINs and EINs. What are they and how do I get one? So if you're interested in learning more from Professor Lipman, I encourage you to go to our YouTube channel and check out that series. And I just put that link in the chat. So thank you again, Professor Lipman. Thank you to our scholars and alumni for attending this session. We greatly appreciate it. Do know that this session is also recorded and we will be uploading it to YouTube in the next couple days. So you can also look back at that recording as well. All right, take care and enjoy your weekend.
And I want to
Bye-bye.
applaud you. I cannot believe you had 78 items in the chat room. So that is tax talk at its best.
At its best, that's correct.
Professor Lipman, there's a question in the chat that says, how can we connect with you?
So Nicole has my email and I think she can attest. I'm very responsive to emails.
Yes, so if you're okay sharing, yeah, I
I
can
am.
share your email with scholars so they can email me directly.
Mhm.
Otherwise, I will also put Francine's email in the chat right now.
And if you Google my name, a lot of things about me will pop up. Hopefully all good things.
Hopefully so, but all right. Well, everyone enjoy the rest of your Friday and
Have a
take
great
care.
weekend. And go
Bye.
Padres. Go Padres.